Eastern fashion and living a life of scandalous adultery with Cleopatra. Octavian told anyone who would listen that the new Dionysus had lost touch with Roman values that were of course exemplified by Octavian, the new Apollo. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 50, The Donations of Alexandria. Last week, we focused mainly on Octavian's trials in the West. So this week, I want to begin by tracing Antony's activities in the East before moving on to the final falling out between the two triumvirate colleagues. Because after failing miserably to conquer Parthia, Antony's status in Rome will plummet, leaving him vulnerable to political broadsides by Octavian, who will launch an all-out propaganda blitz against him. Neither being shrinking violets when it came to the game of power politics, the war of words escalated quickly into simply war. As I said last week, 41 BC had opened with bad news for the triumvirate. While Octavian dealt with the revolt cooked up by Fulvia and Lucius Antony, Mark Antony was faced with a preemptive strike by the Parthian Empire against Syria. In a running war with the charismatic, popular, and brilliant Parthian prince Pakur. Before the Romans were able to react, the Parthians had overrun Syria and Judea and placed puppets on the thrones of both kingdoms. Constantly distracted by internal Roman politics and the preparations for his larger offensive, Antony left the prosecution of these initial Parthian campaigns to lieutenants, specifically a capable general named Ventidius. In 38 BC, Ventidius was able to corner and kill Pakur in battle outside of Antioch, but he was curiously unwilling to follow up his victory and take an important Parthian stronghold on the Euphrates River. Word began to trickle back to Antony that Ventidius was accepting bribes to hold back his forces. So Antony relieved the general of command and headed out to take control of the situation himself. But with winter approaching and the city untaken, Antony prudently chose to withdraw the attack. Plutarch mentions that he took home with him some 300 Greek talents, a friendly gift from the Parthians that of course had nothing to do with him breaking off the siege. In 37 BC, though, Antony was ready to go on the attack. Not only had he settled affairs with Octavian and renewed the triumvirate, but he also reaffirmed his alliance with Queen Cleopatra. As with the last time Antony and Cleopatra had established friendly terms with one another, the most recent summit produced another child. With all the money he would ever need and 100,000 troops finally organized and ready for action, Antony decided it was high time he put his stamp on the East. In the beginning, things went splendidly. Basing himself out of Antioch, Antony swept through Syria and brought the territory back under Roman control. With this reclamation, it was time to do something about the unsatisfactory political arrangements that had governed the East since the days of Pompey the Great. Specifically, Antony was tired of the weak-willed and half-hearted client monarchies which left Rome without buffer states it could really trust. So Antony deposed all the kings from Pontus to Judea, installing Hellenized monarchs he could trust. Men, it should be noted, who were not just loyal to Antony and Rome, but were capable administrators in their own right. Indeed, after Antony's suicide in 30 BC, Octavian would survey the political systems his dead colleague had left behind and see no reason to disrupt any of it. In 36 BC, almost 20 years after Crassus had taken his shot at Parthia, and nearly a decade since Julius Caesar had begun planning his invasion, Mark Antony finally ordered 100,000 troops to march east. Rome was headed back into Parthia. The captured legionary standards of Crassus were still being held as trophies by the Parthian monarchy. Antony intended to get them back, by diplomacy if necessary, but hopefully by force. In the end, he never had the opportunity to use either. The invasion was a complete debacle. Antony's legion set out in June and followed the route through Armenia laid out by Julius Caesar and the route that should have been taken by Crassus. But once in Parthian territory, Antony was, like Crassus before him, at the mercy of local guides. But this time, rather than leading him into a trap, His double-crossing native guides simply fed information to the Parthians about the location of the slow-moving and underguarded Roman baggage train, emphasizing particularly the slow-moving and underguarded nature of it. In a blow that crippled the whole enterprise, the Parthian cavalry arrived out of nowhere and set fire to the line of carts, wagons, and most importantly, siege works. Having spent months moving slowly towards the inner fortresses of Parthia, Antony was now in a bind. His plan had been to capture at least one of the major cities before the end of summer, so he could establish winter quarters. But now, with his siege engines gone, he had no hope of capturing anything. With winter bearing down, Antony realized the whole invasion was irretrievably bollocks. He ordered his stupefied men to turn around and head back to the Mediterranean. The second great blow came when the Armenian king took the occasion of the smoldering baggage train to defect to the Parthians. Antony's only route home now lay through hostile territory. Winter set in across the hills and mountains of Armenia as Antony struggled to get his army home in one piece. While the Armenians prudently avoided outright attacking the Romans, they certainly didn't offer any aid or comfort to Antony's beleaguered army, now dropping like flies in the harsh mountain snows. By the time they made it back to Antioch, the 100,000 men who had left for Parthia were now 75,000. Antony had lost a quarter of his men and not even fought a single battle. He debated the pros and cons of suicide. While his colleague was licking his wounds over the winter of 36-35 BC, Octavian was riding high. Having defeated Sextus Pompey, his own stock had never been higher. But though he was no doubt already planning to eliminate Mark Antony from the picture, Octavian was content to let the older triumvir dig his own grave for a while. But until the time was ripe for a strike, Octavian had a problem. He couldn't afford to dismiss his legions. He would need them for the inevitable confrontation with Antony. But with Sextus gone, he had no real reason to keep them mobilized. So Octavian looked around for some trouble to get mixed up in, and found the perfect excuse in Illyricum. I can't disband the legions, he told the Senate. I need them to fight those barbaric tribes in Illyricum, who have long thumbed their noses at Roman rule. Yes, Illyricum, that's the ticket. So rather than being told where their retirement plots were located, Octavian's soldiers got word that they were needed for the war in Illyricum. What war in Illyricum, they asked. The war you're about to start, they were told. Now get packed. Illyricum was a wild country of fiercely independent tribes located in what is today the Balkans. So beyond giving him an excuse to keep his armies intact, pacifying the region would be a real propaganda coup for Octavian, because Illyricum didn't just border the empire, it bordered Italy itself. Octavian spent the next 2 years off and on in the Balkans. He constructed a fleet to tackle the pirate havens off the east coast of the Adriatic, and himself led the infantry all over the countryside, forcing tribe after tribe to acknowledge Roman rule. He penetrated as far as the Danube River, which Octavian dreamed one day would be the stable border of the empire. In the course of one siege, he even displayed some of the personal courage that had always been conspicuously absent from his career. While his men hesitated on a gangplank leading over a wall, Octavian and a few bodyguards rushed headlong across the short bridge. The episode mirrored a famous episode from the career of Alexander the Great, leading commentators, even at the time, to suspect that the entire scene was a publicity stunt engineered to dispose once and for all of the persistent rumors of cowardice. When reports of the incident made their way back to Rome, Octavian found his reputation greatly enhanced. In 34 BC, while Octavian was entering his second year in Illyricum, Antony was ready to make amends for the shame of his disastrous invasion. He had spent the year and a half that had passed since returning from Parthia, living with Cleopatra in Alexandria. The fact that he was still married to Octavia does not seem to have entered his head at all. Though she had always been a loyal wife, the bond between Antony and Cleopatra had grown far beyond a mere political alliance. Octavian privately, and pretty soon publicly, fumed at Antony's blatantly disrespectful treatment of his sister. What did it say about him that he would ignore a fine Roman woman in favor of some Eastern temptress? But regardless of what the chattering classes thought about it, Antony was perfectly content with his life in Egypt. Some said he had no intention of coming back to Rome at all. And really, why would he? He was passing his days in splendid luxury, ruling over half the known world. Alexandria was a rich, cosmopolitan, and rationally laid-out city. In contrast to hot, crowded, noisy, and messy Rome, there was really no comparison. Arriving in the Egyptian capital after defeating Antony and Cleopatra, Octavian himself would be smitten with the well-thought-out metropolis he found. But rather than dream of moving to Egypt, Octavian dreamed of reinventing Rome. For the duration of his rule over the empire, Octavian, later Augustus, would spend enormous amounts of time, energy, and treasure trying to remake Rome in Alexandria's image, to turn the city of brick into a city of marble. But while Antony slowly went native in Egypt, his sense of Roman honor had not deserted him. The betrayal of the Armenian king had not been forgotten, and as soon as the spring of 34 BC rolled around, Antony set out to remove the offending monarch. Flashing some of the old brilliance, he made short work of the Armenian army and deposed the traitor king without too much difficulty. The victory in Armenia, however, would finally expose the growing distance between Mark Antony and the Roman people. Rather than finding some random, capable noble to reign as the new king of Armenia, Antony placed his own son Alexander on the throne. An even greater affront than the simple dynastic implications of the appointment was that Alexander was Antony's son with Cleopatra, not Octavia, and it only got worse after that. When he returned home to Alexandria, he staged a triumph to celebrate the victory. Never in history had a triumph taken place outside of Rome itself, and Roman opinion was scandalized. And as if the triumph itself wasn't bad enough, at the culmination of the event, Antony read aloud a proclamation that has since become known as the Donations of Alexandria. Just as he had awarded control of Armenia to Alexander, he announced his intention to give Cyrenaica and Libya to Alexander's twin sister Selene, and granted his youngest son Syria and Cilicia. He declared Cleopatra to be the queen of kings, and in the most provocative move of all, named Caesarion, Julius Caesar's son by Cleopatra, king of Egypt, king of kings, and crucially, the true heir of his father. When Octavian and the Senate heard about this series of proclamations, they erupted in outrage. Antony had gone off the reservation and was now putting his illegitimate children in control of Roman provinces. He was, in short, turning the Eastern Empire into his personal kingdom. Octavian, though, as much as he railed against Antony in public for his monarchical ambitions, was not nearly so concerned about what child technically ruled what province and who was inheriting what. What troubled him was the massive navy Antony was constructing. All the military spending Antony had been undertaking of late was ostensibly for his planned reinvasion of Parthia. But you have to wonder, who needs 400 ships to invade the Iranian plateau? And of course, when you got all the way to the inner circle, the threat of Caesarion was acutely felt. Octavian's whole career was predicated on being the heir of Julius Caesar. True, in recent years, he had established himself as his own man, but still, people were following Gaius Julius Caesar for a reason. If the claim of Caesarion's legitimacy began to gain traction, it could threaten the whole project. Now, in Octavian's inner circle was of course Agrippa, but there was also another man of equal importance, who I have thus far inexcusably neglected. Gaius Maecenas was about 7 years older than Octavian and Agrippa, but he had fallen in with the two ambitious youths early on. He had been with Octavian in Apollonia when news of Julius Caesar's assassination came, and he had been a powerful force behind the scenes throughout Octavian's rise to power. Just as Agrippa was Octavian's chief military advisor, Maecenas was his chief political advisor. He had been the guiding force behind Octavian's first marriage to Scribonia, as well as arranging the treaties of Brundisium and Tarentum that had avoided potential civil war with Antony. While Agrippa and Octavian were off fighting battles, it was Maecenas who was left behind to oversee things in Rome, much like Antony had been left in charge of the capital during the campaigns of Julius Caesar. Much like Antony, too, Maecenas had a penchant for extravagant, indulgent living, but where Antony embraced